The bustling cafe was alive with the hum of chatter, clinking mugs, and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. Among the patrons, a 14-year-old boy named Jamal stood near the counter, fiddling with his phone. He was like any other teenager, curious, a little shy, and full of dreams. His hoodie bore the name of his school, and his sneakers were scuffed from basketball games played after class. But what made him truly stand out was the quiet confidence in his eyes, the kind that hinted at a strong upbringing. Unbeknownst to Jamal, his life was about to change in an instant. At the other end of the cafe, a uniformed police officer stood in line, impatiently tapping his badge. Officer Grant was a seasoned member of the force, known for his no-nonsense demeanor. But today his mood was sour. Perhaps it was the long hours, or maybe the pressures of the job had worn down his patience. Whatever the reason, his gaze locked on Jamal with an expression that carried suspicion, completely unfounded, yet heavy. Jamal, engrossed in a message from his friends about a weekend study group, barely noticed the officer's presence. But as he turned slightly, their eyes met for a fleeting moment. To Jamal, it was just another glance in a crowded room. To Officer Grant, it was something else entirely, a spark of irritation, perhaps fueled by implicit biases he didn't even acknowledge. The tension escalated quickly. Grant's voice cut through the cafe's ambient noise as he called out to Jamal, accusing him of loitering. Heads turned. The room grew silent. Jamal, startled, trying to explain that he was waiting for his drink, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer's tone grew sharper, his stance more intimidating. And then, in a moment that would later become the focal point of national headlines, Grant grabbed a steaming cup of coffee from the counter and hurled it in Jamal's direction. Gasps filled the air as the cup narrowly missed the boy, its contents splashing across the floor. The act was shocking, unprovoked, and utterly unjustifiable. But what Grant didn't know, what no one in that cafe could have guessed, was who Jamal's father was. Behind the scenes, Jamal's life was far from ordinary. He wasn't just any teenager. His father was one of the most powerful men in the world, a man who had spent his career fighting for justice, equality, and the protection of civil rights. His father was the President of the United States. As the coffee dripped onto the tile floor and the cafe buzzed with murmurs of disbelief, Jamal stood frozen, not out of fear, but out of the sheer weight of what had just happened. In that moment, the officer's actions weren't just an assault on a young boy. They were a symbol of a much deeper problem, one that the president himself had dedicated his life to addressing. Jamal's phone vibrated in his hand, snapping him out of his daze. A message from his security detail flashed on the screen. Asterisk, asterisk. Are you okay? We're on our way. Asterisk, asterisk. The officer, oblivious to the unfolding reality, barked another command, demanding that Jamal leave the premises. But Jamal didn't move. Instead, he raised his head, his eyes meeting the officer's with a calm defiance that spoke volumes. The room seemed to hold its breath as the boy stood his ground. Outside, the faint wail of sirens grew louder. The sound signaled the arrival of a convoy, not just any convoy, but one that would bring with it a reckoning unlike anything Officer Grant could have imagined. The cafe door swung open, and with it came a gust of cold air and the unmistakable presence of authority. This was just the beginning. The events that followed would spark a national conversation, one that would challenge the system and test the president's resolve as both a leader and a father. Jamal's story was no longer just his own. It was a story that belonged to an entire nation, a story that demanded answers. The cafe was still in shock as the sirens outside grew louder. People whispered among themselves, some fumbling for their phones to capture what was happening, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Officer Grant, standing firm, seemed momentarily disoriented. The commotion had escalated far beyond what he could have imagined when he first confronted Jamal. He glanced around the room, his hand resting on his holster, though no real threat was present. It was an unconscious move, an assertion of authority in a situation quickly spiraling out of his control. Jamal's eyes darted toward the entrance. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing: His father's team never took risks with his safety. The president had made that clear since the day Jamal started high school and began exploring the world outside the confines of the White House. Still, Jamal felt a pang of frustration. He had begged for just one day to blend in, to grab a hot chocolate, like any other kid his age without the looming shadow of security or the burden of his father's name. And now, here he was, at the center of a brewing storm he couldn't escape. Outside, the first vehicle came to a screeching halt. Black SUVs, their tinted windows concealing the passengers inside, lined the curb. Agents in dark suits and earpieces emerged in synchronized motion, their faces set in expressions of steely determination. The sight of them was enough to make the cafe patrons shrink back, some edging toward the door to slip away unnoticed. This was no ordinary police intervention. This was something much bigger. Grant's posture stiffened. He still had no idea who Jamal was, but the sight of the agents sent a chill down his spine. He turned back to the boy, his earlier bravado faltering as he asked, "What's going on here?" "Who are you?" Jamal didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, torn between wanting to assert his identity and staying silent to let the situation play out. He knew the weight his father's name carried and the reactions it could provoke. But he also felt an overwhelming sense of injustice. What had just happened to him wasn't about who he was. It was about how he was perceived. One of the agents entered the cafe, his sharp gaze scanning the room. Spotting Jamal, he moved swiftly to his side, positioning himself protectively between the boy and Grant. "Are you hurt?" The agent asked, his voice calm but laced with urgency. Jamal shook his head, though his hands trembled slightly. The adrenaline coursing through him made it hard to tell if he was scared, angry, or both. Grant, still attempting to regain control of the situation, stepped forward. "What's all this about?" This kid was loitering, and I was just. "Officer, I suggest you step back," the agent interrupted, his tone cool and authoritative. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The room fell silent again. Grant opened his mouth to protest, but was cut off by the arrival of another figure. This one instantly recognizable to anyone who had turned on a TV in the past 2 years. It was the president's chief of staff, a woman known for her poise under pressure and her razor-sharp wit. She strode into the cafe with purpose, her heels clicking against the tile floor. "Jamal," she said, her voice softening as she approached him. "Are you okay?" She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but her eyes betrayed her concern. Turning to Grant, her expression hardened. "Officer, you've made a grave mistake." Grant's face turned a shade paler. "Ma'am, I—" "Save it," she cut him off. "This will be addressed, but not here. Not now." The cafe patrons were riveted. Some recorded the unfolding drama, while others tried to process the surreal scene playing out before them. Jamal, standing at the center of it all, felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. He hadn't wanted this attention, but there was no going back now. Outside, the president himself was being briefed by his security team as he stepped out of a second SUV. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of worry. Jamal was his son. But more than that, he was a representation of everything the president stood for. As he walked toward the cafe, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just a personal issue. It was a stark reminder of the systemic problems he had spent his career trying to combat. Inside, Grant's radio crackled with voices from his precinct, but he didn't respond. He was too focused on the unfolding situation, his mind racing with questions. Who was this kid? And why did it feel like his career was hanging by a thread? The president entered the cafe, and the air seemed to shift. His presence was magnetic, commanding respect even from those who didn't agree with his politics. He locked eyes with Jamal, and in that moment, father and son exchanged a look that said everything words couldn't. "Dad," Jamal began, his voice barely above a whisper. The president held up a hand, silencing him gently. "It's okay, son," he said, his tone steady but firm. Turning to Grant, his expression darkened. "Officer, do you know who I am?" Grant swallowed hard, his earlier confidence completely gone. "Ah, yes, sir." "Mr. President, I." "And do you know who this is?" The president continued, gesturing toward Jamal. Grant hesitated, glancing at the boy who, until moments ago, had seemed like any other teenager. Realization dawned on him slowly, like a cold wave crashing over him. The president took a step closer, his voice dropping low enough that only Grant and a few others could hear. "You didn't just throw coffee at my son. You threw coffee at a young man who represents every child in this country who has ever been treated unfairly because of how they look. And that, officer, is something I will not tolerate." The cafe was so quiet that even the faint hum of the espresso machine seemed loud. Grant didn't respond. What could he say? The weight of his actions was bearing down on him, and the reality of what they represented was impossible to ignore. Jamal, watching the exchange, felt a swell of emotion he couldn't quite name. He was proud of his father, but he also felt the sting of being the one who had to endure the moment that brought them here. This wasn't just about him. It was about so much more. The president turned back to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home," he said quietly. But as they moved toward the door, the murmurs of the crowd began to rise, and Jamal knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond the walls of the cafe. The SUV carrying Jamal and his father drove through the city streets in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the tension. Jamal sat quietly, staring out the window at the passing lights, his emotions a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and embarrassment. His father, seated beside him, glanced over every so often, clearly wanting to say something but unsure of where to begin. They were surrounded by agents in separate vehicles, but in that car, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. At last, the president spoke. "Jamal," he began, his voice measured, "I'm sorry this happened to you." Jamal turned to him, his expression incredulous. "You're sorry? Dad, this isn't just about me. That officer didn't even know who I was. He just saw a black kid and assumed I was doing something wrong." The president sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of both his role as a father and his responsibility as the leader of the country. "I know, and that's what makes this even harder. This isn't just one bad decision by one person. It's part of something much bigger, something I spent my entire career trying to change." "But it's not changing fast enough," Jamal shot back. "And people like him don't think they have to." He was ready to walk away like it didn't even matter. The president nodded slowly, his son's words cutting deeper than he let on. He had seen firsthand how systemic issues perpetuated inequality, but hearing it from Jamal, from someone he loved so deeply, made it all the more personal. "You're right," he admitted. "And that's why we have to make sure this moment means something. Not just for you, but for everyone." Meanwhile, back at the cafe, the scene had shifted. News vans had arrived, their bright lights illuminating the building as reporters scrambled to gather details. Some patrons who had been present during the incident gave interviews, their accounts varying in perspective, but unanimous in their shock over what had unfolded. Social media was ablaze with speculation and outrage, with hashtags like #JusticeForJamal and #CoffeeGate trending within hours. Officer Grant had been escorted back to his precinct, where he sat in a small, dimly lit room awaiting further instructions. The gravity of his actions was beginning to sink in, but his thoughts were a jumble of defensiveness and regret. He replayed the moment in his head over and over, questioning how things had escalated so quickly. He wasn't a bad cop, at least he didn't think he was. But now, the narrative was out of his hands, and the consequences were rapidly approaching. At the same time, in the heart of Washington, the White House communications team was in full crisis mode. Advisors debated how to handle the situation, some pushing for a strong public statement from the president, while others urged caution, warning that too swift a response could be seen as overreach. The chief of staff, having returned from the scene, provided a first-hand account of what had happened, her tone urgent. "We can't afford to stay silent on this," she argued. "The public is already reacting, and they're looking to us for leadership." The president, now back in the Oval Office, listened intently as his team laid out their strategies. But his mind kept drifting to Jamal, to the look in his son's eyes when he said, It's not changing fast enough asterisk. He knew this wasn't just a political issue, it was deeply personal. And he had to find a way to address it that honored both his son's experience and the broader fight for justice. Jamal, meanwhile, was grappling with his own emotions. Back at the White House, he retreated to his room, shutting out the world for a moment of quiet. But quiet was hard to come by when his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends, classmates, and even strangers were reaching out, their messages a mix of support and curiosity. Jamal scrolled through social media, seeing his face plastered across countless posts and headlines. The attention was overwhelming, and he wasn't sure how to process it all. He called his best friend Malik, hoping for a semblance of normalcy. "Yo, did you see this?" Jamal asked, his voice shaky. "Man, everybody's seen it," Malik replied. "Are you okay?" Jamal hesitated. "I don't know. It's like, I'm mad, but I'm also just tired, you know. Tired of feeling like this stuff always happens, and nobody really cares until it's too late." Malik was quiet for a moment before responding. "People care, Jamal. They care about you. And now, they're paying attention. Maybe this time, something will actually change." Jamal wasn't sure if he believed that. But Malik's words gave him a sliver of hope, and right now, that was enough to keep him going. Back at the precinct, Officer Grant was called into a meeting with his superiors. The room was tense, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken accusations. Grant sat across from the police chief, who regarded him with a mix of disappointment and frustration. "Do you have any idea what kind of firestorm you've unleashed?" the chief asked, his tone sharp. "The president's son, Grant. The asterisk president's son asterisk." "I didn't know who he was," Grant said defensively. "He was just standing there, and I thought." "You thought wrong," the chief interrupted. "And now we're all going to have to deal with the fallout. There are already calls for an internal investigation, and you can bet the press isn't going to let this go anytime soon." Grant sank lower in his chair, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. He wanted to explain, to justify, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The damage was done, and there was no undoing it. As the night wore on, the story continued to evolve, drawing in voices from all corners of society. Activists seized the moment to highlight systemic issues within law enforcement, while political pundits debated the implications of the incident. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was just another example in a long line of injustices. Jamal watched it all unfold from his room, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. He felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, knowing that tomorrow would bring even more scrutiny, more questions, and more pressure. But he also felt a spark of determination. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. The president, sitting in the next room, stared at a black notepad, his pen hovering above the paper. He had written countless speeches in his career, but this one felt different. This one had to matter. As he began to write, his thoughts turned to Jamal, to the millions of kids like him who deserved to feel safe, respected, and valued. And with that, he resolved to turn this moment into a movement. The day after the cafe incident, the story had reached a fever pitch. News channels across the country were broadcasting footage of Jamal standing in the cafe, surrounded by agents, while the officer's actions were analyzed frame by frame. Social media continued to erupt with heated debates, hashtags multiplying as everyone from celebrities to grassroots activists weighed in. For Jamal, it felt like the entire world was staring at him, waiting for him to speak or to break. At the White House, the pressure was equally intense. The president's advisors were divided, their voices overlapping as they argued over the best course of action. Some urged the president to give a televised address immediately, framing the incident as a teachable moment for the nation. Others warned against appearing too personal, worried that it might come off as using the presidency to settle a private matter. The president, sitting quietly at the head of the table, listened to the back and forth without interruption. He knew the stakes were high, not just for his family, but for the country. This wasn't just about addressing what had happened to Jamal. It was about addressing what had been happening for decades, if not centuries. When the room fell silent, he finally spoke. This isn't just a political decision. This is a moral one. And it's not just about my son. It's about every parent who's ever feared for their child because of the color of their skin. In the meantime, Jamal was wrestling with his own emotions. He wanted to speak out, to tell his story in his own words. But every time he thought about the enormity of the platform he now had, he felt paralyzed. What if he said the wrong thing? What if his words were twisted or misinterpreted? He wasn't a politician. He was just a kid trying to make sense of something that should never have happened in the first place. Malik called again, his voice buzzing with excitement. Yo, Jamal, did you see what Lebron posted? He's got your back, man. Everyone's talking about you. Jamal managed a small smile. Yeah, I saw. It's crazy. Crazy good, Malik said. This is your chance, bro. Say something. Let people know how you feel. Jamal's stomach churned at the thought, but deep down, he knew Malik was right. He couldn't stay silent forever, not when his voice could make a difference. That night, after much hesitation, he opened his phone and recorded a short video. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he spoke directly to the camera, his voice steady but raw with emotion. What happened to me yesterday shouldn't happen to anyone, he began. And I know it's not just me. This is about something bigger. It's about how we see each other and how we treat each other. And it has to change. The video went viral within hours, shared by millions and praised for its authenticity and courage. But it also drew backlash from those who questioned his motives or downplayed the incident. Jamal tried not to let the negative comments get to him. But they stung nonetheless. He had put himself out there, and now he was vulnerable in a way he had never been before. Meanwhile, Officer Grant's life had taken a sharp turn. He was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, and reporters camped outside his house, eager for a statement. Grant felt trapped, his world shrinking as his actions were dissected and condemned. He began to question not just what he had done, but who he was. Had he let his biases dictate his actions? And if so, what did that say about the kind of person he had become? The investigation into the incident moved swiftly, propelled by the intense public scrutiny. Body camera footage from the officer was released, showing the moments leading up to the confrontation. While the footage didn't capture the exact act of throwing the coffee, it painted a clear picture of an unnecessary escalation. The public outcry grew louder, with demands for accountability and systemic reform. The climax of the story began to take shape as the president prepared to address the nation. He had spent days crafting his speech, drawing on his experiences as a father, a leader, and a lifelong advocate for justice. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him, but he knew this was his opportunity to turn a personal tragedy into a catalyst for change. In the hours leading up to the address, the tension was palpable. The White House was a flurry of activity, staff members scrambling to finalize details. Outside, protesters gathered, their voices a mix of anger and hope. The world was watching, waiting to see what the president would say and how the story would unfold. As the president stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of his face, every slight tremor in his voice. This wasn't just another speech. It was a moment that would be dissected, debated, and remembered for years to come. The nation waited, each viewer holding their breath for what he would say. Jamal, watching from a monitor in the next room, felt a mixture of pride and unease. He trusted his father, but he also knew how fragile public opinion could be. The president began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. He spoke about the incident in the cafe, addressing it not just as a father but as a leader. He acknowledged the pain, the frustration, and the systemic issues that had led to this moment. This is not just about one boy or one cup of coffee, he said. It's about how we, as a nation, choose to see and treat each other. But just as the speech reached its most poignant point, an aide rushed to his side, whispering something into his ear. The president's expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of concern crossing his face. He paused, gathering himself, and continued. Before I go any further, I need to share some breaking news. The room, already tense, seemed to hold its collective breath. The president explained that while the investigation into the cafe incident was ongoing, new information had come to light. A second, unrelated incident involving Officer Grant had been uncovered. A video from several months earlier showing a similarly troubling encounter with another young black man. This footage, leaked to the media moments before the president's speech, painted an even more damning picture of the officer's actions. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room and across the country. The narrative had shifted dramatically. This was no longer just about Jamal. It was about a pattern of behavior, a system that allowed it, and the people who had been harmed along the way. The stakes had been raised, and the demand for accountability had never been louder. Jamal, watching from behind the scenes, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He thought he was the center of the story, but now it was clear that his experience was part of something much larger. He couldn't help but wonder about the young man in the new video. Who was he? What had happened to him? And why had it taken so long for anyone to notice? Meanwhile, the cafe incident and the newly surfaced footage ignited protests in cities across the country. Crowds gathered outside police stations and government buildings, holding signs and chanting for justice. The energy was palpable, both hopeful and volatile. For every voice calling for change, there was another pushing back, arguing that the focus on Officer Grant was unfair or overblown. The divide was stark, and the tension threatened to boil over. Inside the precinct, Grant was informed of the new video. His face went pale as he watched the footage, his past actions now laid bare for the world to see. He didn't remember the encounter in vivid detail. It had been another day on the job, another split-second decision. But seeing it now, through the eyes of the public, he couldn't deny how bad it looked. Worse, he began to realize how blind he had been to his own biases. But even as Grant grappled with his reckoning, a new question arose: who had leaked the footage and why? The timing was suspicious, almost too perfect. Some speculated that it was part of a coordinated effort to escalate the issue, while others wondered if it was someone within the police department, tired of protecting officers who abused their power. The mystery added another layer of intrigue to an already explosive situation. As the president concluded his speech, his tone shifted. "This is not the end of the story," he said. "It's the beginning of a conversation we need to have. About accountability, about justice, and about the kind of nation we want to be." The words resonated deeply with many, but they also sparked more questions than answers. What would accountability look like? How could justice be served for Jamal, for the young man in the new video, and for countless others who had faced similar treatment? And would this moment truly lead to change, or would it become just another chapter in a long, painful history? Jamal, sitting alone after the speech, felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. He didn't ask for this. He didn't want to be a symbol or a rallying cry. He just wanted to be a kid, to live his life without fear or judgment. But now he realized he had a choice to make. He could retreat, letting others take up the fight, or he could step forward and use his voice to demand something better. It was a decision he wasn't ready to make yet, but he knew the time was coming, and quickly. The tension reached its peak as the president's speech concluded, leaving the nation on edge. In the hours following the address, calls for change surged louder, pushing both the White House and law enforcement into uncharted territory. Meanwhile, Jamal remained conflicted, feeling both the weight of public expectation and the deeply personal pain of his experience. The leaked footage had sparked an internal investigation within the police department, and new revelations were coming to light. It turned out the video of Officer Grant's earlier misconduct wasn't the only incident buried in the department's archives. Whistleblowers from within the precinct began to speak out, exposing a culture of tolerance for biased behavior that had allowed such incidents to persist unchecked. The revelations were damning, not just for Officer Grant, but for the leadership that had failed to hold him accountable. Jamal, trying to make sense of everything, decided he needed to meet the young man from the leaked footage. With his father's reluctant approval, and under the watchful eyes of Secret Service agents, Jamal arranged a meeting in a community center. The man, a college student named Andra, was hesitant at first, but agreed to talk. Their conversation was raw and emotional, revealing the shared pain of their experiences and the mutual frustration of feeling powerless in the face of systemic issues. But as Jamal and Andra talked, an unexpected piece of the puzzle emerged. Andra revealed that the person who had leaked the footage was none other than Officer Grant himself. At first, Jamal was stunned, unable to comprehend why the officer would expose his own wrongdoing. The truth was complicated. Grant, racked with guilt and fearing that his career and life were already over, had decided to release the video in a desperate bid to force accountability, not just for himself, but for the entire system he had been a part of. The revelation flipped the narrative once again, casting Grant in a new light. While his actions in both incidents were undeniably wrong, his decision to come clean and expose the broader problems within the department added a layer of complexity to his character. The public was divided, with some viewing him as a coward trying to salvage his reputation, and others seeing him as someone trying, however belatedly, to do the right thing. The climax came as the city hosted a massive public forum, bringing together activists, community leaders, law enforcement officials, and everyday citizens to discuss the path forward. The president attended as both a father and a leader, accompanied by Jamal, who had decided to speak publicly for the first time since his video went viral. The forum was intense, emotions running high as people shared their stories and frustrations. But it was also a moment of unity, as voices from all sides acknowledged the need for real, lasting change. Jamal's speech was the highlight of the event. He spoke from the heart, sharing his own experience, but also amplifying the voices of those who hadn't been heard. "This isn't about one bad cop," he said. "It's about a system that lets it happen over and over again. And we can't fix it unless we're willing to face it together." As the forum concluded, a plan was announced to overhaul the police department's training and accountability measures, with input from community leaders and civil rights experts. Officer Grant, facing legal and professional consequences, agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation and participate in public discussions about systemic reform. While his actions couldn't undo the harm he had caused, his willingness to confront the truth offered a glimmer of hope. But just as it seemed the story was winding down, a final twist emerged. One of the whistleblowers revealed that the culture of misconduct extended far beyond Grant's precinct, implicating higher-ups in the department and even local government officials. The revelation threatened to unravel years of cover-ups, setting the stage for a much larger reckoning. For Jamal, his family, and the nation, it was a stark reminder that while this chapter might be ending, the fight for justice was far from over. As the revelations of systemic corruption began to unfold, the nation braced itself for yet another wave of scrutiny and accountability. Investigations were launched into the higher-ups implicated by the whistleblowers, and the media coverage shifted to exposing the larger machinery that had enabled misconduct to thrive for so long. For many, it was a sobering reminder that change often comes in layers, peeling back one problem only to reveal others buried beneath it. For Jamal, life slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy, though it was a new kind of normal. His story had become a symbol for something much larger than himself, and with that came a mix of pride and responsibility. Returning to school was a challenge. Classmates treated him differently, some with admiration and others with jealousy or skepticism. He leaned on his closest friends, like Malik, who reminded him of the importance of staying grounded. Malik joked one day, "Man, you're like a celebrity now. But don't forget, it was your number one hype man before all this." Jamal smiled, grateful for the reminder that some things hadn't changed. Despite everything, he was still a 14-year-old trying to navigate life, now with the added weight of being a national figure. The president, too, had to adapt to the fallout. His approval ratings fluctuated wildly as he navigated the fine line between being a father and a leader. His decision to directly address the cafe incident and its broader implications had earned him both praise and criticism. Some viewed it as a bold stand, while others accused him of exploiting his position. Yet through it all, he remained steadfast, using his platform to push for legislative reforms aimed at addressing police accountability and racial bias. Officer Grant's journey was perhaps the most complex. After his decision to leak the footage, he became a polarizing figure. Public opinion was split. Some condemned him for his past actions, while others saw his admission of guilt and cooperation as a step toward redemption. Facing criminal charges and stripped of his badge, he began participating in community forums, sharing his experiences and encouraging other officers to confront their biases. It was an uphill battle, but for Grant, it was a chance to contribute to the change he had once resisted. The forum that Jamal had attended became the first of many, evolving into a nationwide initiative aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and communities. These gatherings created spaces for open dialogue, where people shared their stories, frustrations, and hopes. Slowly, they began to chip away at the mistrust that had built up over generations. One day, Jamal and his father visited the cafe where the incident had occurred. It had become something of a landmark, frequented by locals and visitors who saw it as a symbol of change. The owner had put up a mural on one wall, depicting Jamal alongside a diverse group of people, all standing together in solidarity. Jamal stared at it for a long time, feeling a mix of emotions. He turned to his father and said, "I didn't want any of this to happen, but maybe it was supposed to." His father put a hand on his shoulder, his expression both proud and somber. Sometimes the things we don't choose end up defining us the most. But what matters is what we do with it. As weeks turned into months, the changes that had started as a ripple began to grow. Police departments across the country began adopting new policies, including mandatory bias training and independent oversight committees. Activists pushed for broader reforms, and while progress was slow, it was steady. The young man in the leaked video, Andra, became an advocate for criminal justice reform, inspired by his conversations with Jamal and others who shared his experiences. Jamal, for his part, found his own way to contribute. He began writing about his journey, sharing his thoughts and feelings in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. His essays were published in major outlets, and his voice became a source of inspiration for young people grappling with their own struggles. Despite his newfound platform, he remained focused on the simple truths that had guided him from the beginning: the importance of empathy, understanding, and standing up for what's right. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Jamal sat on the steps of the White House, looking out at the crowds gathered for a peaceful march. The chants and songs floated through the air, a powerful reminder of how far things had come and how much further there was to go. His father joined him, the two sitting in comfortable silence. After a while, Jamal said, "Do you think it'll ever really change?"